We've all heard of the Bermuda Triangle and the stories of vanishings and unexplainable phenomena that follow it. But it's not the only corner of the Americas with a high concentration of strange, allegedly supernatural incidents. The Bennington Triangle is a 300 square mile area in southwestern Vermont, centered around Glastonbury Mountain and encompassing most of the Green Mountain National Forest. The area within is wooded, desolate, and quite cold. Sightings of a hairy humanoid monster roaming the area date back to the early 1800s. The Abenaki tribe of the Algonquin Nation believed Glastonbury Mountain was cursed and that there was a stone somewhere on the mountain that devoured any human who stepped on it. On April 4, 1892, a mill worker named Henry McDowell murdered another town resident named John Crowley. After fleeing to Connecticut, McDowell was apprehended and confessed to the crime. But he also said that there were voices in his head that wouldn't leave him alone. The authorities sentenced him to Vermont State Asylum, which was located in Waterbury, roughly 120 miles or 193 kilometers from Bennington. He escaped and allegedly stowed away on a train which took him back to Bennington. He was never seen again. On September 30th, 1897, a Woodford resident named John Harbour was mysteriously murdered in the woods south of Glastonbury. Harbour was hunting with one of his brothers when the latter heard a gunshot in the woods, followed by the sound of Harbour screaming that he had been shot. Despite frantically searching, his brother couldn't find him until the next morning, and by then Harbour was dead. His body was positioned under a tree with his gun propped up next to him, a fair distance from where they had been hunting. No clues were ever found, and no suspects were ever identified. At some point before 1940, an unnamed traveler described seeing a group of mountaineers practicing human hibernation. They saw 4 men and 2 women being sedated, stripped naked, and left outside to freeze one January afternoon. After they turned white and vital signs faded over the next few hours, they were placed in wooden boxes that were nailed shut and then buried under the snow. The remaining residents insisted that the 6 would reawaken when spring came, and even invited the traveler to come back. On May 10th of that year, the traveler came back and saw that all 6 people were revived, healthy, and were at their senses. Between 1943 and 1950, 9 people vanished in the Bennington Triangle. The first to disappear was 37-year-old Carl Herrick in the woods of West Townshend, an area toward the northeastern part of the triangle. Carl was hunting with his cousin Henry when the two were separated. Henry made it back to camp in the evening, but Carl never showed up. When Carl hadn't returned by the time dusk rolled around, it had begun to snow, and Henry contacted authorities for help finding his cousin. After a search lasting 3 days, Carl was the one to find Henry's body. His fully loaded rifle was propped up against a tree 70 feet away. Bear tracks were found near his body, but the autopsy showed that his lungs had been punctured by his ribs. He had been constricted to death. But Vermont does not have any native species of snake that were large enough to crush humans. Carl Herrick's case was mentioned in Missing 411 by David Paulides. Missing 411 is a classification for strange disappearances in sparsely populated, heavily wooded areas. Mental illness and voluntary disappearance must also be definitively ruled out as factors in order for a case to be Missing 411. This, in and of itself, is an incredibly interesting topic, so I might follow up on that in a future video. The next to disappear was 74-year-old Mitty Rivers. Mitty, an experienced hunter who knew the land like the back of his hand, went on a hunting trip on November 12, 1945 with 4 other men. He suggested that they split up and said that he wasn't going to go far before coming back to camp for lunch. They all agreed and went their separate ways. Mitty was never seen again. A search party of both locals and U.S. Army soldiers combed the area for 8 days. During the search, they found a rifle cartridge in a stream that matched the gun that Mitty had, but they never found out what happened to him. In 1946, 18-year-old Paula Jean Weldon, a bright student at Bennington College, vanished while solo hiking on the Long Trail, becoming arguably the most famous disappearance. She left on the morning of December 1st, dressed in light clothing and heading north into the snowy mountains. Paula took to the trail without a jacket, even though it was 50 degrees Fahrenheit and expected to drop into the single digits. An elderly couple walking not far behind her said they saw her turn a corner, and when they reached the same spot, she was gone. She didn't come back that night, and by morning, worry filled the campus. College officials grew concerned, and students went out to look for her, and then the sheriff's department, and then the National Guard. But the snowy woods held on to their secret. There was a lot of speculation on what might have happened to Paula. Maybe she was taken by a serial killer who was never caught, or maybe she had an amnesiac episode and wandered off with no memory of who she was. The search went on, but she was never found. Paula's case led to the formation of the Vermont State Police the following year. At some point in 1947, 3 hunters from Massachusetts disappeared near Glastonbury. An article in the Burlington Free Press, published on October 25, 1981, mentioned the missing trio as having disappeared 2 years after Midi Rivers, but I couldn't find any more information on them or their case, names included. On December 1st, 1949, exactly 3 years to the day Paula Jean Weldon disappeared, another person vanished. This time, it was 68-year-old Army veteran James Tedford. James, who lived at the Bennington Soldiers' Home, was returning from visiting family in St. Albans. Witnesses saw him get on the bus to Bennington, but when the bus arrived, he was gone. His belongings were still on the bus, and his seat even had an open bus pamphlet, but James himself was nowhere to be found. Although he was last seen on December 1st, the news didn't pick up on it until almost a week later, on the 7th. No one ever saw him again. The next to disappear was 8-year-old Paul Jepson on October 12, 1950. His mother had a work task to take care of, so she took him along. Knowing she would be quick, she left him in the truck with instructions to stay put. About an hour later, she came back and he was gone. Paul was wearing a bright red jacket that would have stood out in the surrounding area, but despite that, the search efforts over the next few days never found him, even with the help of tracker dogs. Allegedly, Paul's trail ended by a local highway that was very close to where Paula had disappeared 4 years before. Only 2 weeks after Paul Jepson's disappearance, 53-year-old Frida Langer set off on a hike near Somerset Reservoir with her cousin. Only a short distance from her camp, she fell into a stream. Frida opted to head back to camp to change clothes and assured her cousin that she'd soon catch up. She never did. Worried, her cousin walked back to camp alone to find no sign of Frida. Extensive searches involving planes, helicopters, and hundreds of volunteers swept the area for 2 weeks. There was no sign of her during this search. 7 months later, on May 12, 1950, a chilling discovery unfolded. Frida's body was found along the Deerfield River, approximately 3.5 miles or 5.6 kilometers away from where their camp had been set up at the time. It was impossible to identify the cause of death because her body had decomposed so badly. Of all the Bennington Triangle disappearances, Carl Herrick and Frida Langer were the only ones whose ultimate fates were known, and even then there's still a mystery. Fast forward to 2008, Robert Singley, a music composer at Bennington College, went out for a hike and lost his way. Thankfully, he was discovered the next day, but he described a feeling of dizzying confusion overwhelming him before he lost the trail. Singley was an experienced hiker, properly dressed, and had an arsenal of camping skills, which is likely what led to his survival. Despite that, he was nearly 7 miles off from where he thought he was, and he said that when he turned around to head back, the trail seemed completely foreign, noticing fallen trees and even different scenery that would have been impossible to miss on the way up. Theories about what exactly happens in the triangle range from strong mountain winds knocking people off the trail to the Bigfoot-like Bennington monster having a taste for humans. The theory about the strong mountain winds is founded in science and has a precedent in the area's history. Because hot air rises, wind blows up the slope of a mountain during the day and blows down the slope at night. Glastonbury Mountain could have abnormally strong winds due to its shape, temperature changes, or another reason that I'm not enough of a neurologist to understand. Going back to the Abenaki, they also believed that four winds met at the summit of the mountain, clashing and creating unpredictable air currents. This wind could be stronger during the fall and winter months, since every disappearance occurred between October and December. But does this explain the missing people? Maybe the ones that were hiking, but both Paul Jepson and James Tedford were inside vehicles when they disappeared. As for the Bennington monster, an account from stagecoach passengers in the early 19th century described it as about 8 feet tall, hairy, barefoot, and strong enough to tip over a carriage full of people by punching its side. This sighting also happened during a storm at night, so some details might have been exaggerated. A possible explanation for that sighting might have been Henry McDowell, the convict who escaped back in 1892. After train hopping back to Bennington, he could have lived in the woods, preying on people and animals. Some theories even suggest that McDowell was responsible for the disappearances from 1943 to 1950. It's not impossible that he could have been alive over 50 years later, but it's quite unlikely in my opinion, considering his age, his mental illness, and the regional climate. If I had to take a guess, it might be that Glastonbury Mountain has some kind of natural gas that leaks through from underground, a gas with hallucinogenic or dissociative properties, sort of like a natural version of nitrous oxide, laughing gas. When people find these deposits, be it a tunnel or a crevasse, where the gas surfaces, they become disoriented, confused, and wander off into the forest to never be found. The deaths and disappearances are tragic, strange, and unsettling. However, I think the explanation for whatever is going on could potentially be explained with the same logic used to quote-unquote debunk the Bermuda Triangle. Apophenia is the human tendency to see patterns in random data. Like the Bermuda Triangle, the Bennington Triangle covers a huge geographical area that is generally hazardous to humans without know-how and gear. For the Bermuda Triangle, it's a vast stretch of ocean with intense weather. For the Bennington Triangle, it's a wooded, mountainous frontier with strong winds and below freezing temperatures. The disappearances are a fact of probability. They don't happen any more or less than in any other large area with arbitrarily drawn borders. But because of its history and other people also noticing the pattern, we're inclined to think there's something special about it. As our technology gets better, both for survival and for finding missing people, these disappearances begin to happen far less often. That's why we haven't had any recent high-profile disappearances in the Bermuda Triangle, the Bennington Triangle, or any other of the triangles I'll cover on this channel. But that doesn't make the mysteries themselves any less fascinating. As for the cryptid sightings, I'm not quite sure. We discover new animal species every year, so anything's possible, and I'm optimistic. Tell me what you think in the comments. Thank you for watching, and have a lovely night.